We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe now, because in this video, we answer the one haunting question that has defined this case. 63 days since Nancy Guthrie mysteriously vanished from her Arizona home wearing only her pajamas. She is without her crucial medication, and a source is now sounding the alarm on the investigators. That lack of experience likely compromised the early and most critical moments of this active investigation. Records show the supervisor who first arrived at the Guthrie home had never managed a homicide scene. The central question remains, was there a genuine forensic interest in preserving her life at all? Forensic evidence shows blood was on the porch, the door was propped open, and the scene was compromised. Her pacemaker signal ceased at 2:28 a.m., yet the offender left her vital medications behind. Without those items, her survival was impossible, and the responding supervisor had zero homicide experience. Detectives initially ignored the interior to focus on the timeline preceding the disappearance report. They examined the hours before anyone realized that something was horribly wrong in that house. February 1st, 2026, Tucson, Arizona. An 84-year-old woman vanishes from her home. No signs of forced entry or broken glass were found. There was no struggle, only absence. The last person to see her alive was her trusted son-in-law, a detail that brought scrutiny. While that alone was noteworthy, his subsequent actions made his name impossible for police to ignore. Search teams moved through the desert while helicopters scanned the terrain, and the family begged help. Through it all, he remained silent, offering no public statements or outward signs of expected distress. He failed to react in the way most people would when a close family member disappears. That silence became a key part of the case that investigators simply could not easily dismiss. In missing person cases, behavior is evidence, and Tommaso stood apart from the family. To understand why he became the focus, detectives had to reconstruct her final confirmed movements. They ignored the rumors and focused strictly on the cold, hard facts of the Sunday timeline. Nancy Guthrie had spent the evening at her daughter's house for a routine dinner and conversation. By all accounts, the visit was normal, with no reported arguments or visible signs of tension. At some point that evening, Tommaso drove her home, a fact that remains undisputed by anyone. They arrived at her Catalina Foothills residence, a quiet area where unusual activity stands out immediately. According to his statement, he waited long enough to see her enter the home safely that night. He claims the garage door opened, and he watched her go inside before he finally left. That was the final visual confirmation of her life. Everything after that is buried in uncertainty. Detectives don't rely on uncertainty, so they use technology to narrow the window of her disappearance. The doorbell camera went offline at 1:47 a.m., and her pacemaker sent a final signal. That signal was recorded at 2:28 a.m., confirming a significant event occurred inside that house. Something happened that was powerful enough to interrupt both her digital security and her heart. When investigators processed the crime scene, they weren't looking for the obvious. They were looking for consistency. The problem was that the physical scene did not match what a normal night should look like. The lack of forced entry narrowed the focus, because most residential crimes leave distinct physical traces. Door locks and window frames showed no stress, suggesting a voluntary entry or a familiar face. The home security system had not failed. It was accessed remotely using the correct authorized login credentials. That detail shifted the entire investigation, because it meant the intruder did not guess any passwords. They knew exactly how to navigate the system, what to disable, and precisely when to do it. Investigators then stopped asking who could break in, and started asking who already belonged in that home. Outside the residence, another layer unfolded involving the vehicle used to drive Nancy home that Sunday night. Law enforcement seized the car early, not for proof, but because it was the last physical link. Investigators seized it immediately, not for what it proved on its own, but because it was the final forensic. Vehicles function as mobile forensic environments, holding data, fibers, and critical biological trace evidence. These transfer patterns reveal timelines that human memory cannot. During this phase, media coverage intensified. As interest spiked, journalist Ashley Banfield reported that law enforcement was focusing on Tommaso as a lead. He was considered a central figure internally, though he had not been charged with any specific crime. That distinction is vital. Investigative theories are fluid, but once a name goes public, perception hardens. In this case, the shift was immediate. Photos soon surfaced showing Tommaso and Annie leaving their residence. He shielded his face from the cameras while she avoided direct visibility, fueling further public speculation. These actions could stem from stress or media pressure, but collectively, they created a specific pattern. These behaviors fuel pattern perception. Investigators use these trends to build profiles. The public formed their own theories, while law enforcement moved in a clinical, quiet direction. They seized digital devices and recorded formal statements, methodically completing the initial steps of the inquiry. As these steps concluded, a sudden update from authorities completely upended the prevailing public theory. Exoneration came through DNA comparisons and evidence reviews, yet the public narrative refused to shift accordingly. Once a suspicion takes hold in the public mind, it rarely disappears. The investigation then split. One path followed the public outcry, while the other focused on complex forensic work happening behind closed doors. These two worlds rarely align. Forensic teams were grappling with DNA recovered from a difficult crime scene. The recovered DNA was mixed, meaning multiple people contributed biological material, which creates a massive technical challenge. Isolating a usable profile from a mixed sample requires advanced software and reconstruction techniques that take time. Progress is slow because the work moves from physical action to extreme analytical and forensic precision. Simultaneously, another unit was constructing a digital map by tracking every phone connecting to nearby towers. These thousands of devices weren't suspects, just data points used to establish movement paths and identify anomalies. That is where a behavioral pattern surfaced. Specific devices appeared more than once in the area. These devices were present well before Nancy disappeared, forcing investigators to look at earlier dates in January. They flagged January 11th and 24th long before the public understood the tactical significance of those dates. This introduces a new theory. We are looking at pre-incident activity rather than a spontaneous act. If someone was present before the crime, then the event itself was likely a planned execution. Investigators stopped asking what happened that night and started asking when the actual planning truly began. While labs processed data, Nancy Guthrie's family made a direct appeal, asking the public for specific help. They released a statement focusing on critical time windows January 11th, January 31st, and February 1st. The family urged people to check cameras and revisit memories for any details dismissed at the time. Breakthroughs often come from someone seeing a detail they dismissed as unimportant until the case turned critical. Information does not always come from direct witnesses. It often comes from details that once seemed trivial. This case remains stuck at the intersection of hard data, evidence, and the crushing weight of absence. Despite the volume of evidence collected so far, the most critical question remains unanswered and unresolved. Where is Nancy Guthrie? That single question continues to drive the entire investigation forward every single day. Beyond the headlines, the fact remains that something occurred inside that house between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. Traces were left behind, but they have not yet led to a final conclusion. The mystery persists just as it did on day one. Where is Nancy Guthrie? We need answers. Until she is found, this remains an unfinished story. If you have any information, speak up now. No detail is too small. This is the moment to provide the piece that finally fits the puzzle. Every bit of data brings us closer, but without her, the timeline is missing its final chapter. Public tips often break these cases wide open. Your memory could be the key to everything here. Justice requires facts, but it also requires witnesses willing to come forward and state what they saw. The window of time is narrow, but the impact is permanent. Help us bridge the gap to truth. Every detail matters. If you have information, no matter how small, this is the moment to come forward. Step forward. Call the FBI at 1-800-225-5324 or tips.fbi.gov. The reward is $1.1 million, $1 million from the family, and $100,000 from the FBI. Remain completely anonymous. Certainty is not required, and you do not need proof. Investigators build the case while you provide the specifics. In high-stakes cases, a single detail changes everything. Nancy Guthrie is not just a news headline, she is a person. This case is far from over, and the investigation continues until she is found. When federal agents returned to the Catalina foothills for more questioning, the focus of the case had shifted. It happened away from the headlines, deep within the task force files, because early leads are always broad. Detectives move in every direction at once, chasing every tip and testing every possibility for a forensic break. Eventually, that wide net begins to narrow not because the leads stop, but because certain evidence gains weight. Some clues start to matter more than others. And that is exactly where this missing person case moved next. Back to the neighborhood, not for random door knocks, but for a focused search for specific, actionable information. Local residents noticed something unusual during those follow-up visits. Federal agents stopped asking broad, open-ended questions. They wanted names, specific people, no more general queries about unusual sites. They were hunting for a particular identity. Who worked here and who had access to these homes? That level of surgical precision signals something critical. Investigators weren't trying to understand the event anymore. They were hunting for whoever had the tactical ability to act. That shift moves the timeline into a new phase. Capability is rarely random. It is built through direct access. Mastery requires familiarity and time, which is why the focus shifted toward two very specific categories of local presence. A local rental property and construction crews working nearby. On the surface, these two things seem totally unrelated. Operationally, they share a vital commonality. They both provide a legitimate, cover story reason for being in the area. In an exclusive area like Catalina foothills, that matters. In a place where neighbors notice everything, you must belong. To avoid detection, you must blend in. A rental home provides that camouflage. It allows you to become part of the environment. You move in and out daily, a neighbor among neighbors, and soon enough, no one questions your presence anymore. Construction offers the same mask. Work trucks come and go, crews move around properties, and activity happens at all hours. Nothing stands out. That is what the FBI analyzed, not just who was capable, but who could act without drawing attention. Apply that logic to the official timeline starting on January 11th. That date is documented, not just mere speculation. A masked figure appears at Nancy's front door. They didn't force entry or break in, they were just present. Experienced investigators describe that specific detail in a very clinical way. It was a test, not an attempt. In a premeditated operation, you don't start with the main event. You start with reconnaissance and observation. You study the local environment, the timing, and the potential police response. You learn by doing something small first. That is exactly what January 11th represents, a low-risk action meant to serve a much larger, darker purpose. Move the calendar forward to January 24th. This is another date investigators have specifically highlighted to the public. It isn't publicly explained, but it is important enough for the family to demand focus. That signals a pattern. These are multiple points of contact, not a single event. When points align before an incident, they form a sequence. Detectives are mapping this preparation phase. If this was a planned crime, then February 1st was not the beginning. That was the final execution. That tactical shift changes the way every single piece of forensic evidence is understood. Look at the rental property near Nancy's home. Two competing timelines exist. One says the occupants left before it happened. The other says they fled immediately after. Both cannot be true, but both lead to the same fundamental question. Why does that specific house matter? Whether it was empty or vacated in a hurry, it creates a blind spot. It creates a window where all accountability disappears. No one is watching, and no one is reporting unusual activity. No one notices the things that shouldn't be happening. That is what investigators were trying to resolve on their return. They weren't there to confirm existing facts. They were there to clarify the details that simply did not align. Meanwhile, forensic work continued in the lab. This is where the investigation becomes much more technical and clinical. Analysts recovered DNA, but it was far from a clean hit. Mixed samples with multiple contributors create a challenge. Separating those genetic profiles takes significant time. Until they are isolated, they cannot be matched to a suspect. Once identified, everything shifts. DNA does not merely suggest a presence, it places a person. In a controlled environment like within the victim's residence, physical placement is everything. Any foreign DNA profile recovery requires a logical explanation, and if that justification fails, that biological material transforms into hard evidence. Expand that logic further if a secondary crime scene yields that same genetic marker. The implication strengthens. It establishes a lethal connection between disparate locations, forming a deliberate sequence that detectives are meticulously documenting now. They are not merely identifying a suspect, but tactically placing them across specific points in this forensic timeline. Once that happens, the prosecution's case becomes undeniable. Simultaneously, high-level digital analysis is constructing a parallel evidentiary framework. Cell tower pings are not just about tracking one device, it is about mapping behavioral patterns. Analysts ask which devices occupied the sector, which ones moved, which ones altered their routine, and which ones materialized at times they should not have existed. This data scrubbing is not instant. It requires massive filtering, thinning thousands down to several hundred. Eventually, those hundreds become dozens until the data pool is targeted and actionable. By this phase, detectives have moved past information overload into surgical guidance because specific patterns are repeating. One device surfaced on January 11th, then pinged again on January 24th. These devices were active during the critical window. That repetition is vital because random coincidence does not sustain itself. When a pattern repeats, it becomes the foundation of the forensic structure. Synthesize these facts. A masked figure is sighted weeks prior, followed by the emergence of a second key date. A neighboring property gains significance as construction logs are scrutinized. Unidentified DNA is recovered while digital footprints take shape. Individually, these fragments prompt difficult questions, but collectively, they provide the answers needed. Not in full, but with enough weight to pivot the entire case. The investigation has stopped casting a wide net and shifted toward high-resolution targets, scrutinizing specific individuals, specific movements, and extremely tight timelines. Once a task force reaches this level of focus, the momentum has shifted. The process has transitioned from baseline uncertainty into a rigid structure. Instead of guessing at possibilities, investigators are now demanding to know what aligns with the hard evidence. That narrowing focus yields fewer answers, signaling that the case is closing in, not on theory, but on a final resolution. Yet, despite this clinical progress, the core mystery remains exactly as it was. The same question that has haunted this case from day one. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Until she is found, everything else is just a fragment of an incomplete narrative. At this specific juncture, a seismic shift had already occurred. It was not public knowledge and did not make the evening news, but internally, the trajectory of the hunt changed. Every major investigation hits a tipping point where the search stops expanding and starts pulling violently inward. That pivot is rarely triggered by a single discovery. It comes from the alignment of multiple, independent data streams pointing toward one inevitable conclusion. In the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, that fatal alignment was taking shape. It was not perfect, but it was clear enough that detectives fundamentally altered their tactical approach. General inquiries were abandoned in favor of testing specific hypotheses. To grasp why this shift happened, you must analyze a factor that seemed insignificant early on the immediate environment, not just the home itself, but the surrounding perimeter. Task force members had already established a critical fact: Nancy Guthrie did not vanish during a chaotic or sloppy struggle. She was taken from a controlled environment. There was no forced entry, no obvious disturbance, and zero evidence of panic. This suggests the event occurred within very specific boundaries. When a crime follows such strict limits, it typically indicates the perpetrator understood those constraints beforehand. This points directly back to premeditated preparation, but not preparation in a broad sense. This was preparation tied to geography. As detectives scrutinized the immediate vicinity, a realization set in. This property was not isolated, it was a piece of a larger pattern. This was a neighborhood where visibility is high, where outsiders are noted, and where daily routines are consistent. And that predictable environment presents a massive hurdle for anyone operating covertly, unless they have found a way to bypass it. That was the central question for the task force. How does a suspect move through this space without drawing attention? The solution is not raw speed, it is deep familiarity or the strategic appearance of it. Consequently, investigators focused on two variables, the local rental property and the active construction crew. Both provided something extremely specific: social permission. Not a legal right, but environmental permission. The unique ability to occupy that space without sparking suspicion. When that permission is mapped against the timeline, the picture clears. January 11th, January 24th, February 1st. These are three sequential points: the initial scouting, the secondary alignment, and the final abduction. Detectives no longer view these as isolated incidents, but as a series of calculated steps. Every step proves calculation, as nothing in the sequence suggests improvisation, and improvisation is fundamentally chaotic, unpredictable, and messy. Here, the environment and location remained fixed, showing a rigid consistency that changes everything. That consistency is the catalyst, yet time itself now emerges with surgical clarity, specifically the window used. From 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., a 41-minute window. It is a brief duration, but more than sufficient when an objective is fixed. Long enough for a person with an objective, whereas random actors waste precious minutes through total hesitation. They fumble and create noise, yet none of that is present here. Investigators see cold, calculated efficiency. Efficiency, a sequence perfectly contained within the window, suggesting the person involved required no time to adjust. They arrived knowing exactly what to do, which elevates the concept of preparation from theory to reality. It is the most probable explanation, especially when integrated with digital evidence that records behavior without bias. Cell tower pings do not guess, they log raw data, and what investigators found was a devastating pattern. This was not just a one-time presence, but a pattern of devices appearing on multiple earlier dates. Devices aligned with specific movements before vanishing at critical moments, and that disappearance is the smoking gun. Digital disappearance signals interruption, not absence, and that interruption is always a conscious, tactical decision. Devices are powered down or moved beyond network range intentionally, because phones never simply vanish without cause. Each possibility is critical, especially when multiple devices show synchronized interruptions, creating a forensic structure. This provides a structure rather than just proof. Now, track those devices moving away from Nancy Guthrie's home. They traveled outward in a specific, non-random direction, a vector that investigators had already pinned on their map. Moving away from the residential center toward the desert into high-ground terrain where the physical search begins. Once movement is mapped, search teams follow it with surgical precision, avoiding broad sweeps in favor of logic. They move where digital data intersects with geographic reality, following movement patterns that finally make sense. Movement patterns and travel times dictate the search, ensuring investigators are no longer guessing where to look. They are tightening the circle because distance matters. How far could a suspect travel in that 41-minute window? Which routes are accessible? What terrain offers concealment? These questions are calculated with brutal, mathematical precision. Those calculations drive every tactical move, while forensic experts build a parallel layer of evidence using DNA. DNA is paramount because it provides physical placement. It moves a suspect from a theory to a location. Once physical placement is locked, the evidence chain holds. However, The genetic profiles are still being separated. Placement remains incomplete while profiles are processed, which is why this forensic phase demands such extreme patience. Accuracy outweighs speed. A single confirmed profile changes everything. Now, look at the entire scope of evidence. We have a rigid timeline, a controlled environment, and clear indicators of preparation through digital patterns. Repeating patterns, aligned movement, and a significant location, though the DNA results remain frustratingly unresolved. The investigation is no longer wide open, it is narrowing, and that narrowing creates a massive amount of pressure. As possibilities vanish, focus intensifies. That internal clarity is making the path forward visible to investigators. Internal clarity triggers the transition from speculation to action, though that action remains behind a wall of silence. Because the case is still being refined and tested, every piece of evidence must be flawless before the next move. Every timeline and forensic connection must hold firm, and that is exactly where the investigation currently stands. Closer than ever and far more defined, the investigation remains incomplete because one critical element is still missing. That missing piece is Nancy Guthrie herself, and until her location is secured, the entire structure remains unfinished. Everything else is just a structure moving toward a final point. There is a moment when the focus shifts. The core question changes internally, and not in the way that outside observers or the media might expect. Early on, investigators struggle to understand what happened, resulting in a massive, wide-ranging collection of data. They chase every lead simultaneously, moving in all directions, until a fundamental shift forces the investigation to tighten. The expansion phase is over, tightening has begun, and that is exactly where the Nancy Guthrie case sits now. Well past the beginning, we are in the phase where every collected fact is being forced to align. This is the critical phase, because cases are now built for a legal outcome, not just a theoretical possibility. Outcome is everything. The fact that the timeline remains unchanged is more important than any other forensic detail. When visual confirmation vanishes, time becomes the only structure. 1:47 a.m. The camera goes dark. 2:28 a.m. The pacemaker stops. These timestamps are surgical, not estimates. They are immovable anchors. This means every action, every movement must fit inside that narrow window. Detectives begin here, not by speculating on motives, but by analyzing the physics of that timeline. Time dictates behavior and restricts physical movement. It creates a ceiling for distance and travel. Limited behavior becomes predictable. At the same time, one fact remains firm. There was no sign of forced entry. This detail removes entire scenarios because breaking in leaves traces. Entry by force creates forensic noise. It generates chaos. None of those markers exist in this home. Whoever walked through that door did not need a crowbar. That is not a guess, it is forensic deduction. Deduction narrows a suspect pool faster than hearsay. Now, consider the next layer of this technical puzzle. The camera did not simply malfunction, it was compromised. Data shows the system was intentionally accessed. Someone understood the interface. They did not guess. They operated it, introducing the element of knowledge. We are talking about specific environmental intelligence. They knew the blind spots and how the hardware functioned. Interrupting a security system without a single alarm trigger requires more than luck. It requires prior exposure. Repeated, direct exposure to the target. Now, look beyond the walls to the surrounding Catalina foothills. This neighborhood is not anonymous territory. It is highly structured, deeply observant, and incredibly predictable. Any outlier activity draws immediate attention. This creates a high-stakes problem for anyone lacking a valid reason. Investigators are laser-focused on two specific leads, a local rental property and nearby construction projects. Both provide more than just a place to hide. They provide something far more valuable: operational legitimacy. Legitimacy allows a person to exist in plain sight. They can move without triggering a single red flag. These elements explain the physics of the crime. They show how a presence could remain unnoticed. Revisit the calendar. January 11th, January 24th, February 1st. 3 specific sequential dates. This is a clear progression, not a coincidence. the appearance, the alignment, and finally, the terminal event. Law enforcement views this as a tactical buildup. Pre-event activity almost always suggests a level of preparation. Preparation changes the entire profile of the subject. It proves intention and premeditation over reactive impulse. Connect this to the digital footprint. Cell tower pings do not lie. They reveal rigid behavioral patterns. Which devices were active? Which ones moved together? Which ones suddenly altered their daily routine? Most tellingly, which devices broke their standard sequence? A device that vanishes during a crisis is suspicious. When a signature disappears during the critical window, it breaks the pattern. That break is a signal. Breaking pattern does not prove guilt immediately, but it provides the focal point for the entire investigation. Now, look at the outbound data. Devices near the home began moving away after the event. They did not drift aimlessly, they moved with purpose, leaving the residential streets for the rugged desert terrain. While this does not confirm the final outcome, it creates a trail that investigators are now following. Search teams are moving with precision. They are not scanning blindly. They are following the data. Modern forensics relies on data-guided movement. This is a surgical operation focused on high-probability zones. Behind the scenes, the lab work continues. DNA remains the most volatile and vital evidence available. Mixed samples from multiple contributors complicate the analysis, but they do not negate the final result. Once those genetic profiles are isolated, they become definitive. They provide an undeniable identity for the suspect. DNA does not suggest, it identifies. When that profile hits, the legal process will move with speed. Until then, the lab remains meticulous. A single error in interpretation can compromise the entire chain. Survey the current landscape, a locked timeline, no forced entry, system access, and documented preparation. Add repeating digital patterns, movement toward the desert, and active DNA processing. The circle is closing. This is no longer a sprawling search. It is a structured, data-driven hunt for a specific individual. The pace is deliberate, not because of a lack of progress, but because every link must be unbreakable. Every connection must hold. That is where we are, closer than it appears. Peace. The timeline is clearer now, yet it remains fractured, anchored by one singular question that still remains. The same question that has haunted this case from the beginning. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Until that is answered, everything else remains a fragment of an incomplete record. Before we close, one priority outweighs any analysis. If you hold any information, regardless of how small it seems, this is the moment to act. Contact the FBI. Call 1-800-225-5324. Tip: $1 million from the family plus $100,000 from the FBI. Stay anonymous. You do not need to be certain or possess forensic proof. Detectives build the legal case while you provide the missing detail. In cases like this, a single detail shifts the entire trajectory. Nancy Guthrie isn't just a headline, she is a person. This case isn't over until she is found. Until that moment, this active investigation continues with full force.